December 25, 1989. While most of the world celebrated Christmas morning, Romania witnessed one of the most dramatic political executions in modern history. Nicolae Ceaușescu, the man who had ruled Romania with an iron fist for over 2 decades, lay dead alongside his wife Elena in a military courtyard. But their deaths were merely the beginning of a story that would span decades and consume an entire family. The Ceaușescu name, once synonymous with absolute power and fear across Eastern Europe, would become a curse that haunted those who bore it. What happened to the children, grandchildren, and extended family of Romania's former dictator? How did they survive in a country that had erupted in violent revolution against their patriarch? And what price did they pay for carrying one of history's most despised surnames? Today, we uncover the tragic fate of the Ceaușescu family, a story of exile, persecution, mysterious deaths, and the impossible burden of a toxic legacy that refused to die with its creator. To understand the tragedy that befell the Ceaușescu family, we must first grasp the magnitude of power they once wielded. Nicolae Ceaușescu didn't merely rule Romania, he transformed it into a personal kingdom where his word was law and his family occupied the highest echelons of power. When Nicolae Ceaușescu rose to power in 1965, he brought with him a vision of Romania as a workers' paradise. But as the years passed, this vision transformed into something far more sinister, a cult of personality that placed the Ceaușescu family at the center of Romanian life. Every aspect of the nation's existence was filtered through their desires, their whims, and their paranoid need for control. Elena Ceaușescu, his wife, held the position of deputy prime minister and was widely considered the second most powerful person in the country. Their influence extended far beyond politics. Elena controlled the nation's scientific research, despite having no formal education beyond elementary school. She demanded to be called Comrade Academician, Doctor Engineer, and insisted on being listed as the primary author of numerous scientific papers she had never read. The scientific community was forced to play along with this charade. Researchers would write papers, then add Elena's name as the primary author. International conferences were arranged where she would present work she hadn't contributed to, while real scientists sat in the audience, applauding the theft of their intellectual labor. The humiliation was complete and systematic. Their 3 children, Valentin, Zoya, and Nicu, were groomed from birth to inherit this empire. Valentin, the eldest, became a nuclear physicist and was positioned to potentially succeed his father. Despite his scientific credentials, he was never allowed to forget that his achievements were secondary to his political destiny. Zoya, their daughter, worked in the mathematics department of the University of Bucharest, where her colleagues walked on eggshells around her, knowing that a single misplaced word could mean the end of their careers. Nicu, the youngest and most problematic, was being prepared for political leadership despite his notorious reputation for violence and excess. From childhood, he displayed troubling behavior that would have been immediately corrected in any other family. Instead, his actions were covered up, his victims silenced, and his path to power carefully maintained. The family lived in obscene luxury, while ordinary Romanians faced severe shortages of food, heating, and basic necessities. Their palaces were filled with gold fixtures, crystal chandeliers, and artwork looted from museums. The Ceaușescu residence in Bucharest was a monument to excess. Rooms lined with marble, halls decorated with priceless art, and private quarters that resembled something from a fairy tale. They traveled in convoys of Mercedes-Benz limousines, their routes cleared by security forces, and their destinations prepared weeks in advance. When they visited factories or collective farms, elaborate facades were constructed to hide the reality of Romanian life. Entire villages were painted and decorated for their visits, with healthy-looking actors replacing the actual workers. The psychological impact of this lifestyle on the Ceaușescu children cannot be overstated. They grew up believing that they were fundamentally different from other people, that rules didn't apply to them, that their desires were more important than others' needs, and that their family's power was natural and permanent. This upbringing would prove to be a catastrophic foundation for the trials that awaited them. But power built on oppression and fear is ultimately fragile. When the Romanian Revolution erupted in December 1989, the Ceaușescu dynasty crumbled within days. The speed of their fall was breathtaking, from absolute rulers to fugitives hiding in the countryside, then to defendants in a military tribunal, and finally to executed criminals, all within a matter of weeks. The revolution began in Timișoara, sparked by protests against the forced relocation of a Hungarian pastor. Within days, the unrest spread across the country. The Romanian people, who had endured decades of oppression in silence, suddenly found their voice. The security forces, who had seemed invincible, began to crumble under the weight of popular anger. Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu, who had lived in a bubble of sycophancy and false reports, were completely unprepared for the reality of their situation. They fled Bucharest in a helicopter, still believing that their loyal supporters would rally to their defense. Instead, they found themselves abandoned, hunted, and ultimately captured by the very people they had oppressed. The execution of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu on Christmas Day 1989 was broadcast on television, their bullet-riddled bodies displayed as proof that the nightmare was over. But for their surviving family members, the nightmare was just beginning. The moment Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu's bodies hit the ground, their surviving family members became targets of a nation's rage. The Romanian people had endured decades of oppression, forced relocations, food shortages, and systematic brutality. Now they had faces and names to focus their anger upon. The revolution had unleashed emotions that had been suppressed for decades. Citizens who had been forced to applaud the Ceaușescu family in public now openly called for their destruction. The very mention of the family name provoked violent reactions from people who had lost loved ones to the regime's brutality. Valentin Ceaușescu, 41 years old at the time of his parents' execution, was a respected nuclear physicist who had largely stayed out of politics. Unlike his younger brother Nicu, Valentin had maintained a relatively low profile and was considered the intellectual of the family. He had spent his career focusing on scientific research, believing that his academic achievements would protect him from the political upheavals that might one day engulf his family. But his surname made him a marked man. Within hours of the revolution's success, Valentin was arrested and imprisoned. The charges against him were vague: association with the former regime, potential knowledge of state secrets, and the simple fact that he was Nicolae Ceaușescu's son. He spent the next year and a half in jail, not for any specific crime, but simply for being born into the wrong family. The prison where Valentin was held was overcrowded with former regime officials, security officers, and anyone else associated with the fallen government. The conditions were harsh, a deliberate contrast to the luxury the family had previously enjoyed. Valentin, who had grown up in palaces, now shared a cell with common criminals and political prisoners. The psychological impact on Valentin was devastating. He had believed that his scientific work would shield him from politics, that his contributions to Romanian research would be recognized and valued. Instead, he found himself treated as a criminal, his life's work dismissed as irrelevant compared to his family connections. His wife and children were also targeted. They faced constant harassment, threats, and surveillance. His children, who had grown up as privileged members of the elite, suddenly found themselves pariahs in their own country. They were expelled from exclusive schools, banned from social clubs, and shunned by former friends whose families now feared association with the Ceaușescu name. Zoia Ceaușescu, 45 years old and a mathematician, faced similar persecution. She was also arrested and held in custody, though for a shorter period than her brother. Her academic career was destroyed overnight. The University of Bucharest, where she had worked for years, expelled her immediately. Her research was discredited, her publications removed from libraries, and her name erased from academic records. The treatment Zoia received was particularly cruel because she had genuinely tried to maintain her professional integrity. Unlike her mother, who had fraudulently claimed scientific achievements, Zoia's mathematical work was legitimate. She had earned her degrees through actual study and had contributed real research to her field. But none of this mattered once the revolution began. Her colleagues, who had once shown her respect and deference, now treated her with open hostility. The same people who had carefully maintained cordial relationships with her now publicly denounced her, eager to prove their loyalty to the new regime. The mathematical community, which had once been her professional home, closed its doors to her permanently. The extended Ceaușescu family also faced persecution. Cousins, nephews, and distant relatives found themselves under suspicion simply for sharing the family name. Many were fired from their jobs, expelled from their homes, and subjected to constant surveillance. The guilt by association was complete and unforgiving. The treatment of the Ceaușescu children revealed the complex moral questions that arise when a dictatorship falls. How much responsibility do family members bear for the crimes of their relatives? Should children be punished for the sins of their parents? The Romanian people, driven by decades of suffering, were in no mood for such philosophical debates. The media played a crucial role in amplifying the hatred toward the family. Romanian television and newspapers, newly freed from censorship, competed to publish the most damaging stories about the Ceaușescu family. Every aspect of their lives was scrutinized. Every luxury they had enjoyed was contrasted with the suffering of ordinary Romanians. Former servants and employees came forward with stories of the family's excesses and cruelties. These accounts, whether true or exaggerated, were published without question, feeding the public's appetite for revenge. The family members had no way to defend themselves, no platform to tell their side of the story. But it was Nicolae Ceaușescu who faced the harshest treatment, and perhaps deservedly so. Unlike his siblings, Nicolae had been an active participant in the regime's brutality. As the heir apparent to his father's political machine, he had developed a reputation for violence, corruption, and shocking cruelty that rivaled even his parents. The youngest Ceaușescu son had been positioned to potentially inherit power, but his behavior had become increasingly erratic and violent. Stories emerged of him beating servants, assaulting women, and using his position to terrorize anyone who crossed him. When revolution came, the Romanian people had very specific reasons to hate Nicolae beyond his famous surname. Of all the Ceaușescu children, Nicolae's story is perhaps the most tragic and disturbing. Born in 1951, he was the youngest child and his father's chosen successor. From early childhood, he was groomed for power, indulged in every whim, and protected from the consequences of his actions. This combination of unlimited privilege and zero accountability created a monster. Nicolae's childhood was spent in the rarefied atmosphere of the Communist Party elite. He attended exclusive schools, where teachers were instructed to never correct him, never challenge him, and never suggest that he might be wrong about anything. His classmates were the children of other high-ranking officials, all of whom understood that Nicolae's favor could advance their family's positions. As he grew older, Nicolae's behavior became increasingly erratic and violent. He was known to arrive at parties with armed bodyguards, demand that other guests leave if he didn't like them, and engage in violent outbursts that terrorized Romania's elite. His drinking problem began in his teenage years and quickly escalated to dangerous levels. The young man who should have been learning statecraft was instead learning that power meant never having to face consequences. When he crashed expensive cars while drunk, new ones appeared. When he destroyed property during his rages, it was quietly repaired. When he hurt people, they were silenced through threats or bribes. His treatment of women was notoriously brutal. Nicolae viewed women as objects to be used and discarded, and his position gave him access to anyone he desired. University students, actresses, and even the daughters of party officials were all potential targets. Those who refused his advances faced serious consequences. One particularly disturbing incident involved a university student who had caught Nicolae's attention at a party. When she politely declined his invitation to dance, he became enraged. Within days, she was arrested on fabricated charges of spreading anti-government propaganda. Her family was forced to watch helplessly as their daughter disappeared into the Romanian prison system, a victim of the heir's wounded pride. The young woman spent 3 years in prison, during which time she was subjected to interrogations, forced labor, and psychological torture. Her crime was nothing more than refusing to dance with the dictator's son. When she was finally released, she was a broken person, unable to resume her studies or her normal life. This pattern repeated itself dozens of times throughout Nicolae's young adulthood. Women who rejected him faced arrest, harassment, or worse. Their families were threatened, their careers destroyed, their lives turned upside down. The reign of terror that Nicolae conducted against anyone who displeased him was systematic and ruthless. Nicolae's behavior became so problematic that even his father began to worry. Nicolae Ceaușescu, who had ruled through fear and violence for decades, found his own son's actions excessive. There were reports of heated arguments between father and son, with Nicolae warning Nicu that his behavior was becoming a liability to the regime. But changing Nicu's behavior would have required acknowledging that the system that had created him was fundamentally flawed. The Communist Party's culture of absolute power and zero accountability had produced exactly the kind of person one would expect. Someone who viewed other human beings as disposable objects to be used for his pleasure. The protection of the Ceaușescu name was absolute. No matter what Nicu did, no consequences followed. Police reports were buried. Victims were silenced, and witnesses disappeared. The few officials who tried to hold him accountable found themselves transferred to remote positions or quietly dismissed from their posts. As Nicu entered his 30s, his behavior became even more erratic. He began to show signs of severe mental instability, alternating between periods of manic energy and deep depression. His drinking increased to the point where he was rarely sober, and his violent outbursts became more frequent and unpredictable. The Romanian intelligence services, who monitored every aspect of the family's life, documented Nicu's deteriorating mental state with growing concern. They worried about what would happen if he actually inherited power, but they were powerless to intervene. The heir apparent to the Romanian throne was clearly unfit to rule, but the system that had created him was incapable of correcting its mistake. When the revolution began in December 1989, Nicu was serving as the Communist Party leader in Sibiu County. His response to the uprising was characteristically brutal. He ordered security forces to fire on protesters, personally oversaw torture sessions, and vowed to drown the revolution in blood. His actions during those final days sealed his fate. The protesters in Sibiu faced some of the worst violence of the entire revolution, largely because of Nicu's personal involvement in the crackdown. He seemed to take pleasure in the brutality, treating the suppression of the uprising as a personal game. His direct involvement in the violence would later provide prosecutors with clear evidence of his crimes against humanity. After his parents' execution, Nicu was captured and put on trial. Unlike his siblings, who were arrested mainly for their association with the regime, Nicu faced specific charges of genocide and crimes against humanity. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Witness after witness testified to his cruelty, his direct involvement in the regime's worst atrocities, and his personal responsibility for countless deaths. The trial was a sensation, providing the Romanian people with their first detailed look at the heir to the Ceaușescu dynasty. What they saw horrified them. Here was a man who had been given every advantage in life and had used those advantages to cause immeasurable suffering. The legal proceedings against the Ceaușescu family members revealed the complexity of transitional justice. How do you prosecute the family of a dictator in a country still learning how to be free? The Romanian courts struggled with questions of individual versus collective guilt, the nature of complicity, and the difference between association and participation. Nicu's trial was the most straightforward. The evidence against him was extensive and personal. Survivors of his violence testified in court, describing beatings, humiliations, and worse. Former colleagues in the Communist Party detailed his direct involvement in ordering crackdowns on protesters. The picture that emerged was of a man who had used his position to indulge in sadistic behavior on a massive scale. During the proceedings, Nicu showed no remorse. He appeared in court disheveled and often intoxicated, hurling insults at judges and prosecutors. His behavior during the trial only reinforced the public's perception of him as a monster. In September 1990, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for genocide and other crimes against humanity. The trials of Valentin and Zoya were more complicated. Both had maintained that they were not involved in their parents' political activities and had focused on their academic careers. The prosecution struggled to find specific evidence of wrongdoing beyond their family connection and their privileged positions within the regime. Valentin's defense was particularly compelling. Colleagues from the nuclear physics community testified that he had been a competent scientist who had stayed out of politics. His research had been legitimate, and there was no evidence that he had used his position to harm anyone. The case against him gradually weakened as the initial revolutionary fervor subsided. Zoya's situation was similar. While she had benefited from her family name and her academic career, there was little evidence that she had been involved in the regime's crimes. Her mathematics research, unlike her mother's fabricated scientific contributions, appeared to be genuine. The Romanian justice system faced a difficult balance. The public demanded accountability for decades of suffering, but the rule of law required actual evidence of wrongdoing. As the months passed, it became clear that while the Ceaușescu name carried a heavy burden, it was not itself a crime. Eventually, both Valentin and Zoya were released, though their freedom came with unofficial conditions. They understood that they would never be fully accepted in Romanian society, and that their careers were effectively over. The family name that had once opened every door in Romania now closed them all, but their legal troubles were far from over. Throughout the 1990s, both siblings faced repeated investigations, harassment from authorities, and constant surveillance. They lived in a legal limbo, neither fully exonerated nor officially condemned. After their release from prison, the surviving Ceaușescu family members faced an impossible choice: attempt to rebuild their lives in Romania under constant scrutiny and hostility, or flee to exile and abandon their homeland forever. The decision would split the family and lead to decades of separation and tragedy. Valentin Ceaușescu chose exile. In 1991, he fled Romania with his family, eventually settling in the United Kingdom. The journey to Britain was itself a humiliation for a man who had once traveled in luxury. He arrived as a refugee, carrying only a few belongings and facing an uncertain future in a country that viewed him with suspicion. The transition was devastating for a man who had spent his entire life at the pinnacle of Romanian society. In Britain, he was nobody, just another middle-aged refugee with a famous surname that opened no doors. The nuclear physicist who had once worked on Romania's most sensitive projects now struggled to find employment in his field. His qualifications, while impressive, were viewed with suspicion by Western institutions. Who could trust someone so closely connected to a communist regime? Even his legitimate scientific achievements were tainted by association with his family's crimes. The work he had done in nuclear physics, which had been his passion and his identity, was now viewed as potentially dangerous collaboration with a totalitarian state. Valentin's attempts to find work in British universities were met with polite rejection. Academic institutions, even those that prided themselves on their openness, were reluctant to hire someone with such a controversial background. The few interviews he received were uncomfortable affairs, where potential employers seemed more interested in his family history than his scientific expertise. The family's financial situation was desperate. The fortune that the Ceaușescu family had accumulated over decades of rule had been frozen or confiscated by the Romanian government. Valentin and his family found themselves living in modest government housing, surviving on minimal social benefits, and facing an uncertain future. The psychological impact on Valentin's children was particularly severe. They had grown up as Romanian royalty, attending the finest schools and enjoying privileges that most children could only dream of. Now they found themselves in a foreign country, struggling with a new language, and bearing a name that made them objects of curiosity and suspicion. At school, Valentin's children faced constant questions about their grandfather. Their classmates had learned about the Ceaușescu regime in history lessons, and the children found themselves having to explain and defend their family's past. The burden of carrying such a toxic legacy was overwhelming for young people who had no control over their circumstances. Valentin's exile was marked by poverty and isolation. He lived in modest accommodations, far from the palaces of his youth. His attempts to integrate into British society were hampered by his background, his accent, and the constant suspicion that surrounded him. The man who had once been destined to potentially rule Romania now struggled to find his place in a small British town. The isolation was particularly difficult for someone who had grown up surrounded by people eager to gain his favor. In Romania, Valentin had been an important figure, respected for his scientific work and feared for his family connections. In Britain, he was just another immigrant, ignored by most and viewed with suspicion by others. Zoya Ceaușescu made a different choice. She remained in Romania, determined to rebuild her life in her homeland, despite the obstacles. This decision would prove to be equally tragic, though in different ways. Her commitment to staying in Romania was motivated by a stubborn belief that she could overcome the hatred directed at her family name. In post-revolutionary Romania, Zoya faced constant harassment and discrimination. She was unable to find work in her field of mathematics, as no institution wanted to be associated with the Ceaușescu name. The university that had once been her professional home now treated her as a pariah, and her former colleagues went out of their way to avoid any contact with her. The Romanian media showed her no mercy. Every aspect of her life was scrutinized and criticized. If she appeared too comfortable, she was accused of hiding stolen wealth. If she appeared to be struggling, she was dismissed as seeking sympathy. There was no position she could take that would satisfy a public still processing decades of trauma. Photographers would follow her to the market, documenting her purchases and speculating about her finances. Journalists would interview her neighbors, searching for any detail that could be used to paint her in a negative light. The constant surveillance and harassment took a severe toll on her mental health. Zoya's living situation became increasingly precarious. She had been forced to move from the family's luxurious residences into a modest apartment. But even this was seen as too comfortable by some critics. She faced constant pressure to demonstrate her poverty, to prove that she was suffering appropriately for her family's crimes. The loneliness was perhaps the worst aspect of her situation. Former friends and colleagues avoided her, fearing association with the despised family name. She became a recluse, rarely leaving her modest apartment and speaking to almost no one. The woman who had once been part of Romania's intellectual elite now lived as a ghost in her own country. Her attempts to find some form of work were constantly frustrated. Even menial jobs were denied to her, as employers feared the negative publicity that might result from hiring a member of the Ceaușescu family. She was trapped in a situation where she was too notorious to find employment, but too poor to live comfortably. The contrast between her current life and her privileged past was stark and deliberate. She had grown up in palaces, attended by servants, with access to the finest education and cultural opportunities. Now she lived in a small apartment, surviving on minimal resources, with no career prospects and no social connections. The psychological impact of this dramatic fall was devastating. Zoya had spent her entire life as part of Romania's elite, and she had no skills or experience for dealing with poverty and social rejection. The mathematical mind that had once tackled complex problems now struggled to cope with the basic challenges of daily survival. As the 1990s progressed, tragedy began to strike the Ceaușescu family with alarming frequency. The deaths that followed were shrouded in mystery, raising questions about whether the persecution of the family extended beyond legal proceedings and social ostracism. Nicolae Ceaușescu, still serving his prison sentence, began to show signs of severe health problems. His heavy drinking, which had been legendary during his years of privilege, had continued in prison and was taking its toll, but his declining health raised uncomfortable questions about the conditions of his imprisonment. Prison officials insisted that Nicolae was receiving adequate medical care, but visitors reported that his condition was deteriorating rapidly. He appeared gaunt and weak, a shadow of the powerful young man who had once terrorized Romania. His behavior became increasingly erratic, and there were reports of him suffering from severe depression. On September 26, 1996, Nicolae Ceaușescu died in a Bucharest hospital. He was only 45 years old. The official cause of death was listed as cirrhosis of the liver, attributed to his chronic alcoholism. But questions immediately arose about the circumstances of his death. Had Nicolae been denied proper medical treatment as an act of revenge? Were the prison conditions deliberately harsh to ensure his suffering? Or had he taken his own life, unable to face the reality of his situation? The Romanian authorities provided few answers, and the family was given little information about his final days. The death of Nicolae and Elena's youngest son marked a turning point for the family. The heir who was supposed to inherit power had died in disgrace, alone and forgotten. His death served as a stark reminder of how completely the Ceaușescu dynasty had been destroyed. But Nicolae's death was only the beginning. Over the following years, other family members would die under circumstances that raised even more troubling questions. In 2006, Zoya Ceaușescu was found dead in her Bucharest apartment. She was 63 years old and had been living in poverty and isolation for over a decade. The official cause of death was listed as lung cancer, but the circumstances of her death were deeply disturbing. Zoya had been dead for several weeks before her body was discovered. She had died alone, with no one to notice her absence or mourn her passing. The woman who had once been part of Romania's most powerful family had become so isolated that her death went unnoticed by the world. The discovery of Zoya's body shocked even her critics. Whatever her family's crimes, the image of the former dictator's daughter dying alone and forgotten was profoundly tragic. It highlighted the complete destruction of the Ceaușescu family and raised questions about the nature of justice and revenge. Had Romanian society gone too far in its persecution of the Ceaușescu family? Was there a difference between justice and cruelty? Zoya's lonely death forced the country to confront uncomfortable questions about how it had treated the children of its former oppressor. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Ceaușescu legacy was its impact on the third generation. The grandchildren, who had no choice in their family name, and no responsibility for their grandfather's crimes. These children, born into privilege but raised in exile and shame, faced unique challenges that would shape their entire lives. Valentin Ceaușescu's children grew up in Britain, far from Romania, but unable to escape their family's shadow. They attended British schools, where their classmates eventually learned about their grandfather's regime in history classes. The children who had once been Romanian royalty now faced the playground taunts and whispered comments of their peers. The psychological impact on these young people was profound. They had to reconcile the grandfather they remembered, who had been kind to them during family visits, with the monster described in history books. This cognitive dissonance created deep emotional struggles that would persist throughout their lives. As they grew older, the Ceaușescu grandchildren faced difficult questions about their identity. Were they Romanian? British? Neither. Their homeland had rejected them, but their new country viewed them with suspicion. They existed in a liminal space, belonging fully to neither world. The practical challenges were equally daunting. When applying for jobs, universities, or even social activities, the Ceaușescu name created immediate complications. Some institutions rejected them outright, while others subjected them to intense scrutiny. The family name that had once guaranteed success now guaranteed discrimination. Some of the grandchildren chose to change their names, hoping to escape their heritage. Others embraced their identity, arguing that they should not be punished for crimes they had not committed. Both approaches came with their own costs and complications. The children who remained in Romania faced even harsher treatment. They were subjected to constant surveillance, harassment, and discrimination. Their educational opportunities were limited, and their career prospects were virtually non-existent. The sins of their grandparents had been visited upon them with unforgiving persistence. One particularly tragic case involved a granddaughter who had been born after the revolution. She had never known Nicolae or Elena Ceaușescu personally, yet she faced the same discrimination and hostility as those who had grown up in the regime. Her only crime was her bloodline. This young woman struggled with severe depression and social isolation. She was unable to form normal relationships because potential friends and romantic partners were deterred by her family name. She lived in a constant state of shame and anger, emotions that were entirely imposed upon her by circumstances beyond her control. The treatment of the Ceaușescu grandchildren raised fundamental questions about inherited guilt and collective punishment. In a society struggling to come to terms with its traumatic past, the children became symbols of unresolved anger and unhealed wounds. The persecution of the Ceaușescu family extended beyond Romania's borders, creating international complications that would persist for decades. The family's attempts to seek refuge in other countries were met with suspicion and hostility, as governments struggled to balance humanitarian concerns with political considerations. When Valentin Ceaușescu fled to Britain, his presence created a diplomatic awkwardness. The British government was committed to providing refuge to those fleeing persecution, but Valentin's family connection to one of Europe's most notorious dictators made him a controversial figure. British officials found themselves walking a tightrope between legal obligations and political sensitivities. The media attention surrounding Valentin's exile was intense. British newspapers tracked his movements, reported on his living conditions, and speculated about his wealth. Every aspect of his life was scrutinized, from his housing arrangements to his children's education. The family that had once valued privacy above all else now lived under constant public observation. European intelligence agencies also took an interest in the surviving Ceaușescu family members. There were concerns about potential hidden assets, ongoing connections to former regime elements, and the possibility of revenge attacks. The family found themselves under surveillance by multiple governments, their communications monitored, and their activities tracked. The Romanian government's pursuit of the family also created international complications. Romanian authorities repeatedly requested assistance from other countries in investigating the family's assets and activities. These requests put foreign governments in difficult positions as they struggled to balance cooperation with Romania against the rights of individuals who had committed no crimes in their jurisdictions. The case of the Ceaușescu family highlighted the complex legal and ethical questions surrounding the families of deposed dictators. Should the children of tyrants be held responsible for their parents' crimes? How should democratic societies treat those who bear the names of history's villains? These questions had no easy answers, and different countries responded in different ways. Some nations, particularly those with strong rule of law traditions, insisted on treating the family members as individuals rather than extensions of the former regime. Others, especially those with similar experiences of dictatorship, were more sympathetic to Romania's desire for comprehensive accountability. The international dimension of the Ceaușescu family's persecution also revealed the lasting impact of the Cold War on European politics. The family's fate became entangled with broader questions about post-communist transition, the nature of justice in societies emerging from dictatorship, and the responsibilities of the international community. As the years passed, some members of the Ceaușescu family attempted to find redemption and rebuild their lives. These efforts were met with varying degrees of success and failure, highlighting the complex relationship between personal responsibility and inherited guilt. Valentin Ceaușescu, despite his exile and the challenges he faced, gradually found ways to contribute to society. He became involved in charitable work, using his scientific background to volunteer for educational organizations. His quiet dignity and obvious intelligence slowly won him respect among those who got to know him personally. However, Valentin's attempts at redemption were complicated by his refusal to completely disavow his parents' legacy. While he acknowledged their crimes and expressed regret for the suffering they had caused, he also maintained that they had genuinely believed they were working for Romania's benefit. This nuanced position satisfied neither those who demanded complete condemnation nor those who expected filial loyalty. The surviving family members also struggled with questions about their own complicity. Had they benefited from the regime's crimes? Should they have spoken out against their parents' actions? Could they have done anything to prevent the atrocities? These questions haunted them and made their search for redemption even more difficult. Some extended family members chose a different path. They completely rejected the Ceaușescu name and legacy, changing their identities and cutting all ties to their notorious relatives. This approach allowed them to escape the worst persecution, but came at the cost of severing family bonds and denying their own history. The Romanian Orthodox Church played a complicated role in the family's search for redemption. While officially condemning the Ceaușescu regime, some clergy members showed compassion for the surviving family members. They argued that forgiveness was a Christian duty and that the sins of the parents should not be visited upon the children. However, this position was deeply unpopular among many believers who had suffered under the regime. The family's attempts to honor their dead also created controversies. When they sought to hold proper funeral services for Nicu and later for Zoya, they faced opposition from both authorities and the public. The simple act of mourning their relatives became a political statement that many Romanians found offensive. These struggles highlighted the complex nature of collective memory and the difficulty of separating individual tragedy from historical justice. The Ceaușescu family's search for redemption was not just a personal journey, but a reflection of Romania's broader struggle to come to terms with its past.